Hello, I wanted to take just a moment to introduce the difference in this video compared to what you're normally seeing. We did not have the recording equipment for the class that we did this unit on. And second, honestly, I thought it'd be a lot more discussion oriented, which is always difficult to do when we have the microphone that we just have attached to the camera. So we're going to go through it this way, a little bit different than what you've had in the past, but it should get you caught up on the conclusion of what we set up the prior week, where we handed out the episodes that make up Abraham's life, and we basically asked people to go through and to take a look at one of the four plot lines that we see in Abraham's life. We focused last week on this struggle between faith and expediency, and we wanted everybody to kind of go through that and take a look and say, does any one of these three or four episodes that they got in their group relate to faith? Or Abraham doing something in his own flesh, or doing something in an expedient nature. And so this is the follow-up to this now, because we're going to look at the other three plot points, and we're going to look at how these things are interconnected with one another and how points flow or influence one another as we look at the entire story. Of course, one of the things we should be looking for is what's called the denouement, the final act of the play or movie or narrative in which all the strands of the plot are drawn together and matters are explained or resolved sort of satisfactory. But we're going to be able to do more than that, because again, if I ask you what the main or the concluding story of Abraham's life is, I think all of you could probably come up with it right off the bat. But by looking at it through this lens, we're going to see more than just that moment in time, and we're going to be able to, I think, if more effectively deal with the strengths and weaknesses of the entire unit. So let's spend a little bit of time here recounting some of the things that we covered the week before. Again, we're looking at this narrative approach so that we can use rules that we would apply to any other account that we've read, either a historical fiction or straight up science fiction, fantasy fiction, any kind of fiction. We have a set of rules that we run through unconsciously, I think, for most of us in our head, that help us to understand the story. And a lot of times we set that aside when we come into Genesis, and it's finally here with Abraham and then, of course, Isaac and Jacob, that we really get into the heart of the narrative components of Genesis. And so we really want to spend time looking at this, because in this case, we've talked about this already. The form that we see, this idea of toledotes and chapters, are important because the meaning is now inseparable from the form. How we get it is important to seeing what the meaning is. One of the rules that we talked about was, again, you would do really well just to focus on what happens to the protagonist in the story. And of course, who is the protagonist in this Toledote? Well, it's Abraham, right? He's the main character that runs through this whole thing. We're going to see that there are two other characters who are also, I would consider, somewhat main, but again, they are attached to him in some way, shape, or form through a relationship. So they're not the main point of it, but they absolutely rise to the level of vice protagonists, if that were. And the idea behind all of this is to sit there and take a look at these people, and we'll just name them Abraham, Sarai, and Lot. One of the things that's helpful to do is to understand that we should be looking at them as people who are undertaking an experiment in living. And the experiment in living is tested during the course of the action and these plot lines that we're laying out. And at the end, we should be able to come off and sit there and say, well, in the end, were they successful, or did they fail in some way, shape, or form? And that success or failure is a demonstration of the adequacy or inadequacy of the protagonist's morality or worldview on which this experiment was based. Now, this is how the narrator, in this case Moses, is basically doing what? He's communicating these theological truths to us by looking at how these people are doing this experiment of living. And of course, in this particular case, of living with the creator of the universe, and his interactions with them, his demands on them, his promises to them, the way that he provides for them. All of these things are how Moses is going to give us the theological components of this story. Now, again, this is what's so important about the idea of outcome. If the characters in the stories undertake this experiment in living, then of course the outcome is the important part, because that then becomes the commentary about some significant aspect of human life and value. All right. Now, one of the things I think that happens to us, especially with this Abraham story, is that we really don't ever get the unifying patterns of the story. I've heard dozens of sermons on Abraham's life. You have, or you will in your lifetime, and yet one of the things that is destroyed in the way that most of us have been taught Abraham is this big picture. We're not seeing the unity, the coherence, the emphasis that is occurring between the episodes and these plot lines, because that's what's missing as we look verse by verse, word by word. And oftentimes we get through, we'll just pick on Genesis 12, 1 through 9, because we're going to read that in just a second. But we'll spend 2 or 3 weeks going through something like those 9 verses and miss how it fits into the bigger picture of Abraham, how it fits into the bigger picture of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how it fits into the larger story of Genesis. And so by losing that perspective, I think we end up losing a lot. So that's one of the things we're trying to do today, is to recapture the big picture and to see how it works itself out. Now, again, we talked about this last week. The narrative of Abraham's life is multiple. The plot, I'm sorry, is multiple in Abraham's narrative. It's not episodic, because again, these threads of action follow these principles of unity and coherence. What we want to go off and do is look at these things, because we're trying to find the interrelated elements of these otherwise distinct and discernible actions. So we started last week by looking at number 4, the struggle between faith and expediency. But the other 3 are, we start with the chronological shape of the hero's life. Now, this idea, another way of people talking about this is the heroic epic, right? This, you can think of somebody like the Epic of Gilgamesh to the stories related to Hercules. Abraham falls into that same ancient Near Eastern sort of mindset of, we want to take this person through a series of actions, a series of tests and episodes, and see how their character is defined or refined or established. And so that's our first major plot point. And of course, we would expect to see a lot of this narrative arc related back to this. But it isn't just about the things of a person of 75 years of age kind of going through life until he dies, because there's this second major incredible point, which is this progressive revelation of the covenant with God. God comes into Abraham's life and sits there and says, hey, I want you to think through these things. Interestingly enough, though, the important part of this word is the progressive nature of it. God does not sit down with Abraham right at the beginning and says, okay, here's the full deal. Here's the complete contract. Everything that's going to happen to you, everything I'm going to do for you, everything that goes into this. It starts off just like it did with Adam and Eve, relatively vague. And in fact, if you really step back and take a look at the Old Testament, what we see is there is a progressive revelation of God interacting with his people over time in lots of different ways, and the story becomes more and more concrete, becomes more and more obvious to us what we're supposed to be doing. And that continues even to us today. We have, I think, pretty good ideas of what's going to happen next, but there's still some vagueness to it, right? I cannot describe specifically what I'm going to be doing in the millennial kingdom any more than you can, right? But do I believe that it will be true? Absolutely, because why? It's been revealed as part of the things related to Israel, even back to the Old Testament, not just what we see in Revelation and other New Testament texts. So this progressive idea of revelation with God starts right here with Abraham in a lot of ways. Of course, the quest for a son and descendant begins at the beginning, because again, Abraham's told your offspring. What does that mean when you're 75 years old, your wife is pretty old, and neither of you have managed to have a child yet? So this quest for a son and descendant is one of the more obvious plot points as we go through this. So our goal today again is going to be looking at this resultant matrix. And so if you have not already done so, pause the video, and you should, in the notes of this video, you should find a handout. I want you to go ahead and take the time to go off and print that off, or to have that up, because we're not going to be able to show that whole thing and make it readable during this presentation. So I need you to have it because it's seeing the big picture that is the point of today's unit and the point of today's video. Now, what we're going to go off and do is we're going to go through and we're going to basically what I had hoped you did because of you did your, of course all of you did your homework, right? But last week we divided into these teams and we focused on this last plot point. We sat there and said, okay, does these 3 or 4 episodes for each of the groups do they have to do with Abraham acting in faith or Abraham acting in his own strength, his own understanding, we label that as expediency, right? I'm self-sufficient in this area. God, I got this. I can take care of this. Blah blah blah. And so we went through those things last week, and we kind of wrapped that up. But what we needed to do now is go off and take a look at each of these episodes and look at these other 3 elements of it. So we're going to do that for you right now. Again, the matrix that you've printed off or you have in front of you is my answers to these questions. But I want to walk you through real quick here what that looks like, and we're gonna use Genesis 12, 1 through 9 as an example of how to go off and do this. And so I'm going to read real quick here, Genesis 12, 1 through 9, and then we're going to go through and work through this material. So it says, the Lord said to Abraham, go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So Abraham went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abraham passed through the land to the site of Shechem at the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. He built an altar to the Lord there, and he called on the name of the Lord. Then Abraham journeyed by stages to the Negev. So going through each plot point, what do we observe? Do we see these 4 plot points? And if so, where in the episode? So let's work through our first one. And again, the one that you would expect to see again and again is this very first one, the shape of the hero's life. Now, obviously, everything is different because Abraham was called by Yahweh to leave his land and his father. Nobody else is singled out like this. So the 2 people who accompany him that are going to obviously be the important part points or plot points of this thing in the remaining arc are Sarai, his childless wife, and his Lot nephew. And again, we're introduced to them. So all 3 of these people are going to be a part of the Abraham story, and the relationship that exists between Abraham and his wife and his nephew are going to be elements of the episodes we see from this point forward. The second one, quest for a descendant. Now, again, obviously, this is right here in the beginning as well, because we're told Abraham is 75 years old and without child, which sets up this entire line at this plot point. Second, God has promised to your offspring. Now, this is someone who is considered Abraham's familial descendant. It's very important not to read into it at this time that this is Isaac. For Abraham could adopt somebody, or he could have an heir through a surrogate like Hagar. Progressive revelation, the third plot point. Clearly that's happening here. Just forget the early ones. Just look at the one promise given at Shechem, this very short one. It gives us only 2 points. You will have offspring, but the manner of acquiring them is left unspecified, and you will have this land, even though that is also fairly vague. Now, both of these promises, these 2 promises, are going to be greatly expanded and clarified throughout the remainder of the narrative. So obviously progressive revelation is a part of this. And then the last one, faith versus expediency. Does Abraham exercise faith? Yes, because the story absolutely relates. He leaves as the Lord had told him. So what we get when we look at Genesis 1 through 9 is that all of these plot points are part of this episode. So everything that we're looking for is in this initial 9 verses. We just need to repeat this exercise for each of the episodes and we generate the resultant matrix. And of course, now that we've done this exercise, we're going to step back and look at the big picture, hoping to find patterns and breaks, connections, absences, etc. For these are going to highlight the areas that we should go off and pay more attention to. Now, I want to go off and at this moment in time, while we still have this here, I want to go off and kind of cover a couple of things, right? And the first one is this. I want to look at everything through here, right? And then I want to go off and sit there and say which one of these do not have a second element in it, right? And what we see as we go down through plot number one, right? There's, again, the shape of the hero's life. There's one episode that doesn't have that in it. In fact, one episode that has none of these plot points. We'll come to that in a bit. But if I look at this first plot point, every episode has something that is shaping Abraham's life. So this plot point, it relates to everything about Abraham. And yet, now what I want to go off and look for, there are two that don't have a second element to that. And what they are is the death of Sarah, chapter 23, and of course, Abraham's death, chapter 25, which is just the first 7 verses of chapter 25. Now, if you think about the death of Sarah, we kind of go, you can flip forward a little bit to what chapter 23 ends up looking like. And what we see in here is, again, Sarah lives a nice long life, 127 years. She dies in Kiriath Arba. That again, all that relates back to our Nephilim conversation. And then Abraham gets up and he goes off and he speaks to who? The Hittites. And he says, I'm a foreign resident among you. Give me a burial site among you so I can bury my dead. And then begins this what? This long series of negotiations between the Hittites and Abraham. And as we see down through this, of course, they're like, hey, look, you know what? You are God's chosen one among us. Now, again, incredible statement on their part. They recognize everything that has happened with Abraham up to this moment in time. And so, of course, they will say, none of us will withhold from you burying your dead in one of our places. So Abraham's got an idea of where he wants to put her. He's got this idea that he wants to put her in the cave near Machpelah. And so he starts this negotiation. If you guys can get me in front of Ephron, that would be great. Ephron shows up. Ephron's like, hey, look, I'm going to defer to you, blah, blah, blah. And when we get over to verse 14, I love this. Ephron answers Abraham and says, hey, look, Lord, listen to me. Land worth 400 shekels of silver? What's that between you and me? Go bury your dead. And of course, it's his offhanded way of saying, that's the value I'll take for the land. Abraham counts out 400 shekels of silver, and he buys a single field with a single cave in it, and that defines his property that he will have in his lifetime. And what's fascinating about this, of course, to me is that this is look how long it takes for him to go from the beginning to the end of finding and securing a place to bury his wife. But it is what? It is a series of negotiations and a contract. And again, these are the things that we recognize about Abraham, that he is a person who is defined by covenants, and he is a person who's willing to negotiate. And we see all of that falling out right here in a chapter that most of us kind of skip through. Of course, his death, he's dead, and that's a simpler bit of business from that perspective. But going back to the big picture, our next series of plot points that we get most of in here that were covered almost exclusively again is what? It's the faith versus expediency. Almost all of the episodes in his life have some element of faith associated with them. Now, again, that should not be a big surprise to us, since the New Testament records again and again that Abraham is a man of faith, and that is what we define him as. And so I'm just going to go ahead and bring up, if I can. There it is. These are just some of the places that Abraham is used as an example of faith in the New Testament epistles. Romans chapter 4, he's the main theme that runs through there. Galatians 3, 6 through 9, Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith talks about this, and then James himself will pick this up. I just want to go off and basically read to you Galatians 3, 5 through 9, so you get a sense of, again, how are the New Testament looking back at Abraham, and how have we been introduced to him from that perspective, thousands of years later. Galatians, Paul says, so then does God give you the Spirit and work miracles among you by your works of the law? Or is it believing what you've heard? just like Abraham, who believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. You know then that those who have faith, these are Abraham's sons. Now the scripture saw in advance that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, and proclaimed the gospel ahead of time to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed through you. Consequently, those who have faith are blessed with Abraham, who had faith. And this, when you look at this larger picture and you see that faith is an element of his life again and again and again and again, it's not surprising to us that that is what we think of when we think of Abraham. It shouldn't be an issue for us. But of course, one of the things that we want to go off and do is to take a look at where does he fail these tests. And if you go back and you kind of look through this, right, one of those places that he's going to go off and fail the test happens right here in this first section. The right here when he heads off to Egypt, that's kind of a failure from that perspective, right? He goes down into Egypt. He basically, dismisses his wife as not being his wife. He's afraid of how the Egyptians are going to react. He's afraid that they're going to go off and kill him in some way, shape, or form. And so when we go back and we read in Genesis chapter 12, uh, this section 10 through 20, things don't go very well, right? There was a famine in the land, so Abraham goes down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine in the land was severe. When he's about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarah, look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so it will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account. Abraham enters Egypt. The Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's household. He treated Abraham well because of her, and Abraham acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, male and female slaves, and camels. Everything's working according to Abraham's plans and designs. But in verse 17, the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with a severe plague because of Abraham's wife Sarah. So Pharaoh sent for Abraham and said, why have you done this to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister so that I took her as my wife? Now here's your wife. Get her, take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him and his wife away and all that he had. Well, of course, the nation of Egypt is going to play what? A very large part in the story of Israel. We cannot forget that the first people hearing this are the Israelites sitting in the desert, and I would suggest it's after Kadesh Barnea. They're in that 40-year period of time where that generation's going to pass, but they're hearing this story of Genesis as a story of origins. How did we end up here eating manna every day? And so Egypt is going to play an important part of the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because Egypt is where they found themselves when they were recalled out of Egypt and into the land of promise by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Egypt is going to be a bugaboo in this whole narrative arc for a long time. But one of the other things that we need to do is to take a look at what's the impact sometimes of when he fails these tests. And another time that he gets a failure is when we get on further down to let's go this way, is the birth of Ishmael. Here's another failure point for us, right? And at the end of chapter 16, we go off and we sit there and we read Hagar gave birth to Abraham's son. Abraham gave the name Ishmael to the son of Hagar. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. What's the next verse? When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him. The result of one of the failures of this deal is what? Silence from God for 13 years. Now, it's pretty obvious that this was not exactly how God had it in mind for him, but from Abraham's point, and this is where you now need to take a look back over here on this progressive revelation plot point. What's interesting about this is that God has not sat there and said anything in his revelation in chapter 13, his revelation in chapter 15, that it is going to be the son of Sarah that's going to meet the beginning of the offspring. What he's been told in chapter 13 and what he was told in chapter 15 is very different. Okay, um, let's go back to chapter 13 and we kind of take a look at this, right? We've got this idea that Abraham and Lot have grown too close together. This is one of those faith elements where he passes the test. We'll talk about that in just a second. But just looking at the progressive revelation and the idea of the Son, Abraham goes off and he sits there and says, what? If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. It's not a problem. Take what you want, because why? I think Abraham's acting in faith that God has already sat there and said, this land's going to be your land. And then basically, as soon as that happens, the Lord shows up to Abraham in verse 16 and says, look, go to the north, the south, the east, and the west. I'm going to give you all of this land. It's not, again, it's a much broader explanation of what we got in chapter 12. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth. So if anyone can count the dust of the earth, then your offspring could be counted. Get up, walk about the land, blah, blah, blah. Again, here's the word offspring. Doesn't sit there and say anything about Sarah, does it? Doesn't sit there and say anything about it's going to come from your line or anything along these lines. So when we get to chapter 15, we get this vision, right? Don't be afraid. I'm going to be your great reward, etc., etc. And of course, Abraham argues and says, hey, look, I'm childless, and the heir of my house is essentially a slave, Eliezer of Damascus. You've given me no offspring. So a slave born in my house will be my heir. And then, of course, God comes back and sits there and says, what? No, it's going to be somebody from your own body. That will be your heir. And again, he goes off and reiterates the promise about how, here's everything from this perspective. Now, again, Abraham is rightly concerned about this because he's already what? He's 80 some odd years old at this time. And Sarah, his wife, his natural wife, is clearly quite old herself at this moment in time. But God has only said now what? The progressive nature of this, God has sat there and said, hey, it's going to come from your loins, essentially, right? This is not going to be somebody who's part of your household. This is not going to be somebody who you adopt. This is going to be somebody who is your physical son or daughter in some way, shape, or form. And so, of course, then the process of Hagar and Ishmael makes sense, because why? Abraham is doing what he thinks he understands God wants him to do. The problem is he hasn't done it in God's timing and in God's way, and you get this 13-year gap of time. This is the interaction of these plot points and elements. But I want to go off and take a look at something. If you go up, if you got your piece of paper, again, I want you to notice something. We've gone now through the two big components. The Almost every episode has to do with plot line number one, the shaping of the hero's life. Almost every episode has some element of faith or expedience built into it. And we're really seeing then the connection between 3 and 4 as Abraham shifts back and forth between he's doing well, he's not doing well. He needs more information from God. God provides it. God meets him where he's at with this idea of covenants, because we already saw with the death of Sarah that Abraham is a man who's defined by covenants and negotiations and contracts. God's meeting all those needs. But one of the other things we can fill in the blank with and really spend our time looking at is which of these episodes have every single characteristic in it. And we looked at Genesis 12, 1 through 9, and all 4 of the plot points are in there. The next one, of course, is then what? 13, the separation of Lot and Abraham. Because again, we're hearing what? Obviously, Abraham is being defined who he is. We've already talked about that God is going to meet him at the end. He's going to talk about his offspring. He's going to talk about the land is going to be his. He's expanding what he heard from God in chapter 12. And of course, I think Abraham acts in faith. So chapter 13 is an important chapter for us to take a look at and understand. The next one, chapter 15. Which again, if you spend any time with Abraham, this is the Abrahamic covenant, right? This is where God meets Abraham, not with just verbal promises, but goes through a formal covenant process with him. And of course, Abraham is what? He's basically asleep through this whole thing. This is a unilateral covenant. God is binding himself. Abraham is not binding God in any way, shape, or form. But again, chapter 15 relates to all these elements. It's obviously one of those most important ones. The next time that we will see this will be chapter 22, which of course is what? The death or the offering of Isaac. And so by looking at this matrix, we can do what? We can find the most important chapters to go off and take a look at. And anybody who's familiar with this story would recognize that chapter 12, chapter 15, and chapter 22 are in fact the most important elements or episodes in the life of Abraham, because that's where we get all of our sermons from. Which should lead us then to go off and think about what? what's the deal with Lot, right? Why are we sitting here looking at chapter 13 and dealing with the separation of Lot and Abraham, which should also then allow us to go off and take a look at the obverse of this, which is what's happening with chapter 19, where nothing is mentioned at all. So let's spend a few moments taking a look at that. Again, when we take a look at chapter 15 and Lot, one of the things I think is worth doing is understanding, where does Lot show up again later on? Is Lot described, remember this is an experiment in living, is Lot described as a person of faith in two places where we really get a big historical review of the Hebrew ancient, lines of faith, etc., etc. So Hebrews 11, the hall of faith, Lot's not mentioned. Acts chapter 7, again, Stephen going through the history of Israel. Lot is not mentioned. In fact, Lot is only mentioned in two places. In Luke 17, he's compared to Noah, but he's not compared to Noah in per se the way that you might think about. When Noah entered Noah was eating, everybody in Noah's time was eating, drinking, marrying, having kids, blah blah blah, and then what? Judgment, meaning judgment showed up. Interestingly enough, almost instantly after Noah was what? Rescued. Same thing that happens then when Lot is brought up. Lot, the people of Sodom and Gomorrah were doing what? They were eating, drinking, marrying, having kids, blah blah blah. They were doing the things of life, and then when he is rescued from Sodom, immediately after what? Judgment, and nobody escapes the judgment. So the point of Luke is really not to sit there and say that Lot per se is this great man of faith, but that again, once the righteous person is pulled out, boom, judgment follows. And that is in fact what Peter picks up on in 2 Peter 2:7. The Lord knows how to rescue the godly and keep the unrighteous under punishment. And so for us, when we think through Lot, we tend to have a New Testament viewpoint of him. He's called, this righteous man, but that's Peter basically saying what? He's a godly man, and you find him sitting there in Sodom and Gomorrah, and of course you should ask yourself the question, why is he there? Well, that should also come up with chapter 19. Why in the world are we looking at chapter 19 as having this lack of any plot points here? I mean, there's not a single plot point in chapter 19 that relates to Abraham. It doesn't define him in some way, shape, or form. It's not about him having a kid. It's not about his faith or lack of faith. It's not about any God progressively revealing anything in this way, shape, or form to the covenant. So why is it there? Well, I think the important part to understand is you should ask yourself the question, why is Lot there at all? What's the whole point of Lot even being in Sodom and Gomorrah? And of course, it actually goes back to chapter 13. So in chapter 13, for whatever reason, when Abraham leaves Haran, Lot comes with him. We actually get that from the previous Toledot as well, but we get it right at the beginning in chapter 12. Lot is one of the three people that are important. And as they go down and they are blessed, you can imagine Lot goes with him to Egypt. Lot also is a beneficiary. He's caught up in the promises of Abraham. He gets some of that blessing. He comes back. They continue to have more success. They're too large and too concentrated. They need to split up their herd so that they've got plenty of grazing space, etc., etc. Abraham sits there and says, "Hey, you pick what you're interested in, right? You tell me where you want to go off and go." And of course, Lot's basic answer is what? Lot looked out. This is in chapter 13, verse 10. Lot looked out and saw the entire Jordan Valley as far as Zoar was well watered everywhere. It was like the Lord's garden and the land of Egypt. Of course, this is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose the entire Jordan Valley for himself. And as Lot journeyed eastward, they separated from each other. Now, Lot has done what? He has brought himself into the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because it's beautiful, right? It just looks amazingly attractive. And again, if it's called the Lord's garden, then that's where you want to go off and hang out. So Lot picks the best spot to be. Abraham, secure in his understanding where God is and whatnot, goes off and says, I'll take everything else, that's fine. And then of course God reinforces it with the covenant. But Lot finds himself where? He's on the outside of the city. So that when we get to chapter 14 and the kings go off and they attack. It's a 4-on-5 battle. Lot's caught up in all of this stuff, and he is grabbed. And of course, then what? You have to have um, uh, Abraham go off and rescue him. And so 270 some odd men, or whatever the number is, 240, 270, I can't remember exactly, go up and they recapture everything that was stolen, including Lot, and they bring it back. And of course, the king of Sodom is like, "What? Hey, let's strike a deal, Abraham. I want to make sure that you are beholden to me, so you can keep all of the booty." And Abraham's like, "No, I'm not interested in any way, shape, or form." He basically comes off and he comes back to me, sits there and says, "There's no way that I'm going to go off and do this." He says to him in verse 22 of chapter 14, "I have raised my hand in an oath to Yahweh that I will not take a thread or sandal strap or anything that belongs to you, so you can never say, 'Well, I made Abraham rich.'" Because again, he wants to do, he's what? That's his faith exercise in chapter 14. God has said that he will bless me. I don't need the king of Sodom to go off and bless me. And so the king of Sodom would love, 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 love to have Abraham as a thrall in some way, shape, or form, to have some control over him. Because again, we already read in chapter 24, everybody knows that God has chosen him. That's the tale at the end of the story. Everybody around knows that Abraham is blessed. We'll see the same thing for Isaac. We'll see the same thing for Jacob. But at this time, it's clearly Abraham. So how do I gain control of this chosen person? Well, by enriching him in some way, shape, or form, but that fails. So what is the next best thing? Capture his nephew. Why is Lot in Sodom? Because that's not where we found him in chapter, 14, 13, and 14. He was outside. Now he's what? He's mixed up in this thing by the time we get to chapter 19. And I think the reason is pretty simple and straightforward. The king of Sodom does what? He says, "Well, look, you're my next best thing to help out. I'm going to bring you in." Because we find when the angels show up to Sodom, where do we find Lot? He's sitting in the gate as an elder of the town. He's now part of the warp and woof of the community. And he's been given this position of honor and esteem. So why? The king of Sodom has some leverage over Abraham. Does the leverage work? Absolutely, because we see what? In chapter 18 previously, the negotiations with Yahweh. And Abraham is doing the very thing that God has told him he would be. He is going to be a blessing to all other nations. And in fact, the nations or these kingdoms, these minor fiefdoms, if you want to just go that small with it, of Sodom, Gomorrah, etc., all these people in the Jordan Valley area. That's the important thing about this, is the plot point. It gives us a chance to again see what Abraham, as a negotiator, even willing to negotiate with God on behalf of the righteous, and God, and he works his number down. What's interesting is, just like Luke and just like Peter, the number can just be one person. Just one person is righteous, and God knows how to rescue that one righteous person. Now, as a part of this, and almost as just a kind of a throw in, remember this is a story of origins. And so what do we get? We also get the idea that Moab and Ammon come from Lot. And of course, Moab and Ammon are going to be thorns in Israel's side for a long time. It's going to be difficult getting through Moab to get to the promised land. Ammon is going to have other issues with them over their history and whatnot. But it's fascinating because of course we get what? Ruth, a Moabitess. Where does she come from? She comes from this line and this part of the world, and she's a cousin, or a nephew of Abraham. But tracing out the line, all of these things are pulled together, and so this origin story finds its location here. So with all of that, these plot points then do what? The final culmination is, the sacrifice of Isaac, as you would expect, right? Um, Again, everything comes together. Abraham passes the test. From there, it goes into the death of Sarah. It goes into the betrothal of Isaac, which is what we're going to study next week. The longest chapter in Genesis, chapter 24. We'll take a look at as a final element to the Abraham story. Why is that? Why is it so redundant? Why is it so long? We're going to take a look at that, and then from there we'll look at the remaining Toledotes covering Ishmael, what became of Isaac, what became of Jacob, and wrap up the book. So I hope that this is an exercise. You can see the value of looking at it from the big picture, and then as you see the breaks and as these things come and go, the interaction between these plot points, where all of them are evident. Those chapters are more important than the other chapters where we don't see any of these things, like chapter 19, Sodom and Gomorrah. We need to investigate what's going on there, and we see these bigger pictures and we see the connectedness of this, right? Again, the idea that we see unity, coherence, um, uh, a singular movement forward, and it's through the actions of the character, as well as in some cases their speeches, that we start to hear and see the theological points that Moses is interested in. So I want to thank you for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this.